Have you ever wondered what happens when a suicide mission fails? When a soldier, trained to see his enemy as a demon, is forced to accept that enemy's mercy? This is the story of a man who flew towards death but found humanity instead. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kao Hagawa's knuckles were white as he gripped the control stick of his P-1Y Francis bomber. The air outside his canopy was a storm of fire and smoke. Angry black puffs of anti-aircraft flak blossomed all around him, each one a punctuation mark in a sentence of death. Below, the Pacific Ocean was a canvas of cold, indifferent blue, littered with the steel-gray shapes of the American task force. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, a steel forest, and somewhere in that forest was his destiny, his target, the cruiser USS San Francisco. For Hagawa, this was the culmination of everything. After 2 aborted kamikaze missions, a private vow had hardened in his soul. Madras, I will go to the goal this time. The 21-year-old squadron leader from Nagoya, a city he could barely remember the smell of, commanded 3 bombers that morning. Each carried a single, devastating 760-pound bomb. Each pilot shared a silent, unbreakable pact. Success was death. There was no journey home. But Haga wasn't consumed by thoughts of the final, searing impact, or the brief, violent moment his machine would tear through American steel. His mind was a darker place, haunted by the specter of failure. He'd heard the stories whispered in the barracks, the chilling tales every kamikaze pilot knew by heart. If you survived, if you were shot down before your divine purpose was met, the Americans would not be swift. They would torture you, make you pay for the audacity of your attack. The propaganda officers had shown them photographs, grim, grainy images they claimed were American soldiers posing with the skulls of Japanese warriors. They had read testimonies, filled with lurid details, of how the Americans showed no mercy, no honor. And if, by some cruel twist of fate, the Americans didn't kill you, the shame awaiting you back in Japan was a living death. He had seen it. He had seen the returned pilots, the ones whose engines failed or whose nerves broke. Their eyes were hollow, their presence a poison. The dishonor was an acid that dissolved a man from the inside out, a fate far worse than a quick, fiery end. As the battleship USS West Virginia unleashed a torrent of fire, Hagawa's world compressed into a terrifying tunnel of glowing tracer rounds and acrid smoke. His aircraft shuddered violently with each near miss. Then he saw it. A destroyer, the USS Callahan, turning hard, its guns swiveling, tracking his descent like a predator's eyes. In that splintered second, Hagawa accepted his fate. One way or another, today was the day he would die, either in the glorious explosion of his bomb against the San Francisco, or at the hands of the demons who would fish his broken body from the sea. He never, ever imagined a third option. What happened next would shatter every certainty he held, not just about the war, but about the nature of his enemy. The guns of the USS Callahan roared, a deafening, percussive sound that vibrated through Hagawa's bones. 20-year-old Boilermaker Robert Thatch, watching from the deck, would later recall the brutal efficiency of it all. Within less than 30 seconds, it was all over. We had him in the water. Hagawa's bomber absorbed multiple hits. The impacts felt like giant fists slamming into the fuselage. The aircraft shuddered, lurched violently to one side, and began its final sickening spiral toward the Pacific. He felt the colossal slap as his plane met the water, a shock that rattled his teeth, and then a profound, enveloping nothingness. The force of the crash knocked him unconscious and threw him clear of the mangled wreckage. The ocean, which had just been his target, became his cradle. His 2 crew members never surfaced, swallowed by the waves. The young pilot, the squadron leader, now floated alone, a broken doll in the vast, churning sea. His flight suit, heavy with salt water, dragged him down, and the warm slick of his own blood began to stain the water around him. On the Callahan's deck there was no time for reflection. The battle was a symphony of chaos. Japanese aircraft still swarmed the task force like angry hornets. Every gun crew remained at their battle stations, eyes raw from scanning the sky for the next diving angel of death. The ship's captain, Commander Charles M. Berthoff, stood on the bridge, the fate of his ship and his 320 men resting on his shoulders. He faced an impossible choice. Navy regulations were crystal clear. In the midst of active combat, you do not risk your ship to save one man, especially not an enemy pilot who, moments before, had been trying to obliterate you with a 760-pound bomb. The logic was cold, hard, and irrefutable. But Berthoff, in a moment that would echo for half a century, gave an order that defied that logic. Launch rescue boats. As the sky above them continued to rain fire, American sailors scrambled into small boats and powered toward the dark shape floating in the waves. Leo Jarboe, an 18-year-old gunner from Maryland, watched from his station, mesmerized as his shipmates pulled the enemy from the water. The pilot's body was limp, his face a ghostly pale beneath a mask of oil and seawater. Standard practice, the crew would later explain with a shrug. Friend or foe, if someone was in the water, you tried to save them. But Hagawa knew nothing of American naval tradition. He knew nothing at all. He remained lost in darkness as sailors hauled his dead weight onto the Callahan's steel deck. They laid him down carefully, then immediately spun around and returned to their guns. The battle wasn't over. For the next several minutes, Hagawa lay where they had placed him, just another piece of battlefield debris to be dealt with when time allowed. The men of the destroyer had far more pressing concerns. When Hagawa's consciousness flickered back, it returned with a single, primal, terrifying thought. This is where I die. He lay on the hard, vibrating deck of the enemy ship, the scent of salt and cordite filling his lungs. He braced himself for the end. A bullet to the head, the cold steel of a bayonet, the rough hands of vengeful sailors dragging him to the rail and heaving him back into the unforgiving ocean. He had tried to kill these men. He had sought to ram his bomb-laden aircraft into their world, to send them all to a watery grave at the bottom of the Pacific. Now their revenge would be swift and terrible. He waited. Instead, someone brought him water. A metal cup appeared before his face, held by a young American sailor who couldn't have been much older than Hagawa himself. The sailor said something in English, gentle words Hagawa couldn't comprehend, and gestured for him to drink. Hagawa stared, first at the sailor's face, then at the cup. This was impossible. This made no sense. In all his brutal training, in all the feverish propaganda sessions, in all the hushed, fearful stories whispered among kamikaze pilots in the dark of the barracks, no one had ever mentioned this. No one had ever suggested the possibility that the demons would give you water. He drank. The cool liquid was a shock to his system. The sailor nodded, a simple, human gesture, and walked away. As the fury of the battle finally subsided and the adrenaline began to drain from the crew, more sailors cautiously approached him. They were not gentle, not exactly, but they were not cruel. They worked with an efficient, detached professionalism, assessing his injuries, burns, deep cuts, the likelihood of internal damage from the crash. Someone brought a medical kit. Their hands were sure as they cleaned his wounds and applied bandages. We tried, even in war, to treat men like human beings, Robert Thatch would say 50 years later. But in that moment on that deck, Hagawa's mind couldn't process it. The cognitive dissonance was a physical pain, more disorienting than his injuries. These men should hate him. They should be kicking him, spitting on him. He was the monster who had tried to murder them all. The Callahan remained at battle stations for hours, a vigilant sheepdog still screening the task force from further attacks. Hagawa lay on the deck, drifting in and out of a pained, confused consciousness. Each time he awoke, he expected the brief mercy to have ended. And each time, he was wrong. When the immediate threat had passed, the Callahan transferred Hagawa to the battleship USS New Mexico. He was still barely lucid, his mind a whirlwind, trying to reconcile the impossible reality that he was still alive. Sailors carried him aboard the massive warship, and for the first time since his capture, Hagawa was alone with his thoughts. And his thoughts were a black ocean of despair. Aboard the New Mexico, a floating city of steel and firepower, Hagawa's physical pain was eclipsed by a far greater agony. In the rigid, unforgiving culture of the Japanese military, he had committed the ultimate failure. He had been chosen for a kamikaze mission, the highest honor, the purest expression of loyalty to the emperor, and he had failed. Worse, he had survived. The shame was a physical weight, crushing him, absolute and unbearable. He was no longer a warrior. He was a disgrace. At that time, Hagawa later recalled, his voice heavy with the memory, I thought it was dishonorable not to have succeeded. When I was captured, I was badly injured and did not see any reason to live. Weak from his injuries, adrift in a sea of dishonor, Hagawa made his decision. He would finish the mission his enemies had interrupted. He attempted to take his own life. The attempt failed. An American sailor, assigned to watch over the strange, silent prisoner, discovered what was happening. He raised the alarm. The battleship's medical team rushed to save the Japanese pilot for the second time in as many days. The guard was later scolded by his superiors for his lack of vigilance. But for Hagawa, the message was profound and unmistakable. Even when he tried to die, the Americans would not let him. From the New Mexico, Hagawa was transported to Guam, where he would spend the remainder of the war as a prisoner. During that long journey across the Pacific, something inside him began to shift, a tiny crack in the bedrock of his convictions. The American medical personnel treated his injuries without hesitation. They didn't have to. He was the enemy, a failed suicide bomber. But they set his broken bones, treated the angry burns on his skin, and gave him medicine to dull the constant grinding pain. The sailors assigned to guard him were not the monsters from the propaganda films. They were boys. Teenagers, really, from small American towns with unfamiliar musical names like Maryland and Illinois and Pennsylvania. They were curious. They showed him photographs of their families, worn and creased from being carried in their wallets. They shared their rations with him. Some tried to bridge the chasm of language with clumsy hand gestures and simple drawings. One sailor, with a shy smile, showed Hagawa a picture of his girlfriend back home. He pointed to the photograph, then to his own heart, and smiled wider. Hagawa understood. This American boy was in love, just as Japanese boys fell in love. He had a life, a future, waiting for him after the war, just as Hagawa once had. These were not demons. These were human beings. At the prisoner of war camp in Hawaii, the contradictions continued to mount, dismantling his entire worldview piece by piece. The Geneva Convention, a concept alien to Japanese military doctrine, governed the treatment of prisoners, and the Americans, to Hagawa's astonishment, followed it scrupulously. He received regular meals, not luxurious but always adequate. He received consistent medical care for his lingering injuries. He was housed in barracks that, while certainly not a hotel, were weatherproof and sanitary. His own military had taught him that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death was always preferable to capture. The propaganda had painted American POW camps as chambers of horror, places of torture and execution. Instead, Hagawa found a system built on rules, on regulations, on documented procedures and international law. The Americans kept meticulous records of every prisoner. They allowed Red Cross inspections. They followed protocols. This was not supposed to happen. As the weeks bled into months, Hagawa had something he hadn't had in years: time. Time to think. Time to compare the hell he had been promised with the mundane reality he was experiencing. Time to wrestle with the most fundamental question of all: why? Why had the Callahan's captain risked his ship and crew to save a lone enemy pilot in the middle of a battle? Why had those sailors pulled him from the water instead of leaving him to drown? Why had they given him medical care when he had tried to murder them? Why, most bizarrely of all, had they saved his life when he tried to end it himself? The answer, he slowly began to realize, lay in something deeper than military doctrine or international treaties. It lay in the American character itself. He had tried to extinguish their lives. They had saved his, not because he deserved it. He knew with every fiber of his being that he did not, but because they seemed to believe that even an enemy, even a monster like him, deserved a measure of basic human dignity. This concept was utterly revolutionary to Hagawa. In the Japan he knew, the individual life was a resource, expendable in service to the emperor and the state. But the Americans, they seemed to believe that every single life had inherent, intrinsic value, even the life of the man who had just tried to kill them. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito crackled over the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. For Hagawa, sitting in a quiet POW camp in Hawaii, the news was a complex storm of emotions: relief that the killing had finally ended, profound grief for his lost comrades, deep uncertainty about his own future, and above all, a disorienting confusion about everything he had ever believed. The propaganda had been lies, not just exaggerations or distortions, utter, shameless lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were sailors who showed you pictures of their girlfriends. They were medics who treated your burns. They were guards who stumbled through a few words of Japanese to ask if you were okay. He had volunteered for a kamikaze mission, believing he was fighting evil incarnate. Now, looking back, he wasn't sure what he had been fighting for at all. The treatment Kamikaze received was not exceptional. It was standard. Captain Berthoff's decision to rescue him was not some singular, extraordinary act of mercy. It was simply what American naval tradition demanded. This tradition ran deep, a current of morality flowing beneath the surface of war. Friend or foe, if someone was in the water, you tried to save them. It was a principle that transcended military regulations, rooted in the ancient codes of the sea and a fundamental belief in the sanctity of human life. The Geneva Convention provided the legal framework, but American adherence to it was more than mere compliance. It reflected core national values about human dignity and the rules of civilized warfare. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George Marshall had made this philosophy explicit. American forces would treat prisoners according to international law, not because their enemies reciprocated, but because it was the right thing to do. Because it was who Americans were. This was not naive idealism. There were practical benefits. When enemy soldiers knew they would be treated fairly upon capture, they were more likely to surrender rather than fight to the last man. It saved American lives. It shortened battles. But more fundamentally, American leaders believed that how you treated the defeated defined your own national character. You could win a war through brutality and still lose something essential about yourself in the process. The contrast with the Axis powers was stark and tragic. Japanese military doctrine explicitly forbade surrender. The military code issued to soldiers in 1941 stated unequivocally that death was preferable to the dishonor of capture. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners reflected this contempt. Prisoners were seen as contemptible for having chosen captivity over a noble death. The result was systematic abuse, starvation, torture, and mass execution. American POWs in Japanese custody faced a horrifying death rate of approximately 27%. More than 1 in 4 never came home. By contrast, survival rates for Axis prisoners in American custody were above 95%. German treatment of Western Allied prisoners was generally better, but their catastrophically brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners revealed the darker truth. When the enemy was deemed, quote, subhuman, all protections evaporated. American forces, however, maintained consistent standards regardless of nationality. Japanese, German, Italian, all received the same basic treatment as outlined by international law. For Hagawa and thousands of other Japanese prisoners, this reality produced a profound psychological schism. Everything they had been taught about Americans was a lie. This forced them to question everything else. If the Americans were not demons, what else had been a fabrication? If the war was not a righteous struggle against evil, what had all the sacrifice been for? Decades later, Hagawa would reflect on that pivotal moment of despair. When I was captured, I did not see any reason to live. But after months of humane treatment, his entire perspective, his entire world, had been transformed. When the war finally ended, Hagawa returned to a Japan that was a ghost of the nation he had left. Its cities were smoldering ruins, its people spiritually and physically shattered. He enrolled at Kyoto University, seeking a new purpose. He married, started a family, and eventually built a remarkable business career, pouring the same focused intensity that had once been aimed at an American cruiser into the world of commerce. By 1995, he had risen to become president of Rengo Company Limited, a major international packaging producer with over 4,000 employees. But for 50 years, a question haunted him, a ghost that sat with him in boardrooms and followed him home at night. What ship had shot him down? Who were the men who had saved him? What had happened to them? The memory of that day, May 25, 1945, never faded. It was, as he later described it, the most important day of my life. The day he had expected to die in glory, the day he had survived in shame, The day Americans had shown him an alternative to everything he had been taught. In the early 1990s, now a wealthy and influential businessman, Hagawa began his search. He spent a year digging through dusty war records, consulting with naval historians, painstakingly piecing together the chaotic puzzle of that morning east of Okinawa. Finally, he found it, a name, USS Callahan, DD-792. The destroyer that had both ended his mission and saved his life. But the records revealed a further, tragic twist. On July 29, 1945, just 2 months after pulling Hagawa from the sea, the Callahan was struck by another kamikaze. This pilot succeeded where Hagawa had failed. A bomb-laden biplane crashed into the destroyer. The USS Callahan sank, taking 47 of her crew to the bottom of the Pacific. She was the last Allied destroyer sunk in World War II, lost just days before the war ended. The ship that had saved Hagawa's life had been destroyed by another man just like him. The terrible irony was not lost on him. In July 1995, for the 50th anniversary of the Callahan's sinking, a wreath ceremony was planned at the United States Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. Hagawa contacted the organizers. He wanted to come. He wanted to honor the ship that had saved him, to honor the men who had died, and most of all, he wanted to meet the survivors. He wanted to look into the faces of the men who had pulled him from the water 50 years earlier. The reunion took place in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. About 100 gray-haired American veterans filled the room. When Hagawa, a small, immaculately dressed Japanese man, entered, an awkward, heavy silence fell. These men had watched their friends die in kamikaze attacks. And now, standing before them, was one of the very men who had tried to kill them. Through an interpreter, Hagawa spoke slowly, his voice filled with a quiet gravity. The enemy yesterday can be your friend today. When the war is over, they become friends. The room erupted in applause. Leo Jarbo, the 18-year-old gunner, now a retired plumbing foreman, stood and embraced the former enemy pilot. "To come all the way from Japan to do this," Jarbo said, his voice thick with emotion, "means a lot." Robert Thatch, the boilermaker, put it simply, "The war ended 50 years ago. I think it is time to put all that stuff behind us. I believe in forgiveness." That reunion was only the beginning. Hagawa donated $10,000 to the Navy Memorial Fund in the Callahan crew's name, and he began attending every single Callahan reunion, flying from Japan to America each year to be with the men who had once been his sworn enemies. His generosity was staggering. He hosted lavish dinners for the veterans and their families in Washington's finest restaurants. He would fly his entire staff from Japan to present personalized gifts to every single attendee. He invited high-ranking American admirals, men like Admiral William Crowe and Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, turning these gatherings into powerful celebrations of reconciliation. During one reunion, a Callahan crew member approached Hagawa holding a small, tarnished object. It was the wristwatch Hagawa had been wearing when he was shot down. The sailor had kept it for 50 years. Hagawa was moved to tears. The following year, he presented that sailor with a beautiful jeweled Seiko quartz watch in return. In 2000, Hagawa paid all expenses for Leo Jarbo and 2 of the Callahan's other surviving officers, Jake Highmark and Buzz Bazzetti, and their wives, to spend 10 days in Japan. He showed them his country, introduced them to his family, and shared his culture with the men who had saved his life. He established a naval exchange program, funding opportunities for young American and Japanese students to learn about each other's countries, ensuring the lesson he learned so brutally would be passed on. Each year, until his death in 2004, Hagawa made the long journey from Osaka to wherever the Callahan survivors gathered. The men who had shot him down and pulled him from the sea had become his brothers. In a 1995 interview, a journalist asked him how he had reconciled the shame of surviving his kamikaze mission. His answer revealed the totality of his transformation. "At that time, I thought it was dishonorable. I should mention, however, that now I do not think that way." He had spent 50 years processing that day, 50 years understanding that his enemies were human beings, and 50 years realizing that the greatest honor was not to die in war, but to build peace from its ashes. "There are technically no kamikaze survivors," he told the interviewer, acknowledging the beautiful philosophical impossibility of his own existence. By definition, a kamikaze pilot died. But Kamikaze had survived, because a group of Americans had valued his life even when he did not. The story of Kamikaze and the crew of the USS Callahan is about more than one pilot and one destroyer. It is a testament to the power of humanity in the midst of total war. Consider Captain Berthoff's decision. In those frantic seconds on May 25, 1945, with his ship under attack, military logic dictated leaving the downed pilot to his fate. But he chose mercy over expedience, civilization over vengeance. That single choice, made in an instant, rippled forward through 5 decades, creating friendships, funding educational programs, and becoming a global story of reconciliation. This is the power of holding to your principles when it is hardest. The Callahan's crew didn't rescue Hagawa because he was a good person. He had just tried to murder them. They rescued him because they believed human life, even an enemy's life, deserved respect. That belief, acted upon in millions of similar decisions by American service members, shaped the post-war world. The United States fought a brutal war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Yet within a decade, all 3 former enemies were American allies. This was not inevitable. It required a conscious American choice to help rebuild defeated nations rather than simply punish them. The Marshall Plan grew from the same philosophy that led Captain Berthoff to say, "Launch rescue boats." It is the belief that today's enemy can be tomorrow's friend if you treat them with dignity. Would this have been possible if American POW camps had mirrored the death camps of their enemies? If America had won the war but lost its moral authority? The answer is almost certainly no. America's treatment of its prisoners, while imperfect, laid the foundation for post-war peace. It's easy to dismiss this as a feel-good tale from a bygone era. It is not. The challenge of treating an enemy with humanity when they have just tried to kill you is timeless. It requires enormous discipline and moral clarity. But the lesson of the USS Callahan is that this discipline matters. It matters tactically, encouraging surrender. It matters strategically, making reconciliation possible. And it matters morally, because how you treat the defeated defines who you are. 50 years later, a Japanese businessman stood before a room of American veterans and said, "The enemy yesterday can be your friend today." He could say this because those veterans had chosen mercy in a moment of chaos. That is worth remembering. That is worth celebrating. On May 25, 1945, Kamikaze expected death. He found humanity instead. And that discovery changed everything. The lesson endures. How we treat our defeated enemies defines who we are far more than how we defeat them.
Dear viewers, thank you for being here. Stay tuned to the channel for tons of exciting videos. Every day we upload fresh stories packed with thrills, suspense, and surprises. Don't miss out. Comment, share, subscribe, and hit that like button. This channel is for you, and the best is yet to come.